I have a recurring nightmare that I've never told anyone about. It's not about falling, and it's not about being chased by some faceless shadow in the dark. It is much simpler, and that is why it stays with me. In the dream, I am lying on a table. It is cold, made of porcelain or perhaps steel, and I cannot move. I am perfectly lucid. I can feel the air on my skin. I can hear the hum of insects outside a window I cannot see, but I possess no agency. I am simply matter, meat, waiting to be categorized. And the most terrifying part isn't pain. Pain is a language we can understand. Pain proves we are alive. No, the terrifying part is that the man standing over me believes he is doing something good. He holds a scalpel, not with malice, but with love. He is going to take me apart to find a flaw that only he can see. And no matter how much I scream, my voice will never leave my throat. Have you ever felt that? The distinct, heavy dread that your autonomy is an illusion? That if the wrong person with the wrong title and the wrong authority decided you were broken, they could dismantle you until there was nothing left but a wet smear on a history page? It makes you wonder how thin the line is between medicine and torture, doesn't it? We like to look back at history and pretend that the barbarism is separated from us by a thick wall of years and progress. We tell ourselves that we are safe now, that the monsters are gone. But what if the monsters were never monsters? What if they were scholars? What if they were men of science, praised by their peers, who simply needed a place to work where the screams wouldn't bother the neighbors? I grew up near an old asylum in the Midwest, one of those Kirkbride buildings that look more like a cathedral than a hospital. We used to break in as kids. I remember finding a room with a drain in the floor and scratches on the wall that were too high up to be made by someone standing. I remember touching those marks and feeling a jolt of electricity travel up my arm, a sudden weeping sorrow that didn't belong to me. Do you believe places hold memories? Or do we just project our own fears onto the rot? I think about those scratches often. I think about who made them and if they knew, in those final moments, that they would be erased. That is the true horror, isn't it? Not dying, but disappearing while you are still breathing. Being unmade. Today, I am going to tell you a story that has been buried under layers of soil and shame for nearly 2 centuries. It is not a ghost story, though it should be. It is a story about the human mind and the price paid by those who were considered less than human in the pursuit of understanding it. It is painful. It is deep. And it requires you to sit with the discomfort. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. October 1852, Bayou Teche, Louisiana. The air here is not just atmosphere, it is a physical weight. It presses against your chest, laden with the scent of stagnant water, blooming jasmine, and the sweet cloying rot of things dying in the mud. The sun does not shine so much as it bruises the sky, turning the horizon a sickly violet in the evenings. In this place, deep within the parish, sat the Harrow Plantation. It was not the largest estate in the region, nor the most advanced, profitable, but it was known for its silence. Travelers passing on the river road often remarked on it. There were no songs from the fields, no shouting from the overseers, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to radiate from the main house, a sprawling Greek Revival mansion that looked like a bleached skull resting in the tall grass. But the house is not where our story lives. Our story lives behind it, past the manicured gardens and the weeping willows, past the smokehouse and the stables. It lives in a row of brick cabins that were meant to house the labor force, the enslaved men and women who kept the Harrow functioning. At the end of this row, separated by a grove of dense oaks, stood a structure that did not belong. It was windowless. It was built of stone, not wood or brick. and it possessed a heavy iron door that locked from the outside. The workers called it the quiet room. The master of the house, Dr. Silas Vane, called it the pavilion of neural correction. Dr. Silas Vane was not a planter by trade. He was a man of letters, a graduate of institutions in Philadelphia and Edinburgh, a man who had walked the lecture halls of Europe and debated the nature of the soul with the finest minds of his generation. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that were described in journals of the time as pale and burning with a terrible focus. He had come to Louisiana, not for the cotton or the sugar, but for the solitude. He needed raw materials. He needed subjects that the law would not protect. In the 1850s, the medical understanding of the brain was in its infancy, a chaotic frontier of phrenology, magnetism, and brutal surgery. Vane believed that morality was physical. He believed that defiance, melancholy, and hysteria were not traits of the spirit, but lesions on the brain, swellings of the tissue that could be excised like a tumor. He wrote in his diary, which was recovered decades later from a damp cellar in New Orleans, "The soul is a clockwork mechanism. If the gears grind, one must simply open the casing and file them down. I have found the perfect laboratory. Here, amidst the heat and the isolation, I shall cure the human condition." The arrogance is breathtaking, isn't it? To look at a human being and see only a broken machine. But Vane was not merely theorizing. He was practicing. And his patients were not volunteers. They were young women, purchased specifically for their temperament. He looked for the ones described as difficult, sullen, or prone to fits of weeping. He wasn't buying labor. He was buying symptoms. The descent began with a girl named Ilara. The records of sale list her as 19 years old, of mixed blood sold from a dissolving estate in Virginia. She was described as intelligent but insolent. When she arrived at Harrow, she was not sent to the fields. She was taken directly to the house, where she was bathed, fed, and inspected by Dr. Vane like a prize horse. But he didn't check her teeth or her limbs. He measured her skull. He pressed cold calipers against her temples until she wept. He spoke to her in a soft, hypnotic voice, asking her about her dreams, her angers, her memories. At first it seemed almost benign, a doctor caring for a patient. But the workers in the quarters knew better. They saw the lights burning in the stone building late into the night. They heard the strange rhythmic grinding sounds that echoed through the oaks. Ilara was the first to enter the pavilion. She did not come out for 3 weeks. When she finally emerged, guided by the doctor's hand, she was different. The insolence was gone. The intelligence, too. She walked with a shuffling gait, her eyes wide and empty, focused on a middle distance that no one else could see. She did not speak. She did not weep. She simply existed. Vane paraded her before a visiting colleague from Atlanta, beaming with pride. "Observe," he said, according to the colleague's horrified letters, "the defiance has been scooped out. She is pure docility. I have removed the burden of her anger." The colleague left the next morning, vomiting into the river as his carriage pulled away. He never spoke to Vane again, but he didn't report him either. That is the complicity of history. The silence of good men allows the Silas Vanes of the world to operate in the dark. Now, I want to pause for a second. I know this is heavy. The air in the room feels a little thinner when we talk about things like this, doesn't it? It's a lot to process. The idea that someone's personality, their very self, could be surgically removed while they were awake, without anesthetic, in a stone room in the sweltering heat of 1852. It's horrifying. So take a breath, shake out your shoulders. It reminds me of how we sometimes use humor to cope with the unbearable. I remember being at a funeral once where everyone was laughing uncontrollably at a story about the deceased, tears streaming down their faces, because if they stopped laughing, they would collapse.
Horror and humor are neighbors in the brain. Speaking of neighbors, I want to ask you, does your town have a bad place? Every town has one. The old house on the hill, the abandoned factory, the patch of woods where the birds don't sing. Put it in the comments. Let's exorcise those ghosts together. Reading your stories makes me feel less alone in this research. Back to the Harrow Plantation. The success with Ilara only emboldened Dr. Vane. He purchased 3 more women that winter: Sarah, Mary, and a girl whose name was never recorded, known only as Subject 4. The pavilion became a factory of modification. Vane wasn't just removing anger anymore. He was trying to isolate specific emotions. He wanted to see if he could remove memory while keeping motor function. He wanted to induce religious ecstasy by stimulating the frontal lobe with silver needles. The procedures were barbaric. We have his sketches. He designed a chair. He called it the restraint of mercy, which clamped the head in a vise that's so tight that the subject could not move a millimeter. He did not use ether. He believed that the patient needed to be conscious to report the sensations as he probed the green adder. Imagine the scene: the humidity of the Louisiana swamp seeping through the stone walls, the smell of rubbing alcohol, old blood, and fear. The doctor, sweating in his linen suit, whispering questions to a girl whose skull has been opened like a jewelry box. Do you feel the rage now? Or do you feel the light? The horror is not just in the pain. It is in the intimacy. He knew these women. He spent hours talking to them before he destroyed them. He mapped their fears so he could navigate their minds. It was a violation deeper than any physical assault. It was a colonization of the mind.
By 1854, the Civil War was looming on the horizon, a storm gathering strength. But at Harrow, the war was already happening. It was a war of attrition against the human spirit. The slave quarters were silent, terrifyingly so. The women who were taken to the pavilion and returned were like ghosts haunting their own lives. They performed their tasks with mechanical precision, but there was no light in them. They didn't sing, they didn't comfort their children, they stopped eating unless they were told to swallow. They were the living dead. But then, something changed. Subject 4, the girl with no name, she was different. Vane wrote that her brain anatomy was anomalous. When he probed the areas that should control her defiance, she didn't go blank, she laughed. It started as a low chuckle bubbling up from her chest while she was strapped in the chair, her scalp peeled back. It grew into a cackle, a sound so jarring, so wrong that Vane dropped his instruments. She began to whisper to him, not pleas for mercy. She whispered his secrets. She told him about the coldness of his mother. She told him about the envy he felt for his peers in London. She spoke with a voice that was not her own, a voice that sounded like tearing metal. Vane was a man of science. He did not believe in demons. He did not believe in spirits. But he wrote in his journal that night, "She is not looking at me. She is looking through me, and she sees the rot." The psychological dread at Harrow shifted. It wasn't just the workers who were afraid anymore. It was the doctor. He began to hear footsteps in the upper halls of the mansion when no one was there. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find his surgical tools arranged in strange geometric patterns on his bedside table, patterns he had not made. He became obsessed with Subject 4. He kept her in the pavilion for months, probing deeper, cutting further, trying to find the source of that voice. But the more he cut, the stronger she became. Not physically, her body was wasting away, but her presence filled the plantation. The other women, the cured ones, began to congregate around the pavilion at night. They would stand in a circle outside the stone walls, swaying in unison, humming a discordant, vibrating tone that made the dogs howl. They were a hive mind, connected to the girl in the chair. Vane had tried to break them, to isolate them into manageable pieces, but he had inadvertently connected them. He'd opened a door in their minds that he couldn't close, and something else had walked in. One night in November, a storm rolled in off the Gulf. The wind stripped the shingles from the roof of the mansion. The oaks thrashed like drowning men. Vane was in the pavilion with Subject 4. He was desperate. He was going to perform a lobotomy, a final severance to silence the laughter. He raised the silver pick, and the candle blew out. In the darkness there was no scream. There was only the sound of the restraints snapping, not unlocking, snapping, metal shearing under impossible pressure. The next morning, the overseer found the pavilion door open. The chair was empty. The straps were twisted and broken. Dr. Silas Vane was found 3 miles away, deep in the swamp, wandering in circles. He was unhurt, physically, but his mind was gone. He was catatonic. His eyes were wide, fixed on something terrifyingly vast that only he could see. He never spoke another word for the rest of his life. He was institutionalized in the very asylum he had once mocked as a warehouse for the weak. Why were those jars buried with rosary beads wrapped around them? And why did the foreman of that construction crew go home that night and murder his entire family before turning the gun on himself? The infection of Harrow didn't end in 1854. It was just dormant. If you want to hear what was in those jars and uncovering the second chapter of this nightmare, make sure you are subscribed. Leave a comment below with the word SJP if you're brave enough for part 2. Until then, keep your lights on. The dark has a way of getting inside your head, especially if you leave the door open.